All right, guys. Well, welcome to TBL Day number 2. This one is on the skin. And so we're actually getting into our first organ system, moving past the histology and moving into the first place where we start looking at where multiple tissues come together to create an organ. And that first organ we're talking about is the skin. So we'll have two days on the skin. This is the first day. All right, this is a nice kind of 3D model of the skin in the background that you can see along the way. All right, let's jump into it. So first off, the skin is a pretty incredible layer, right? Incredible protective layer, as it says. Complex set of organs, okay, and it really is more than one organ, it's an organ system, okay, and primarily we're talking about the skin being protective. It's mostly protective functions, okay. It can withstand all kinds of forces, stretching, washing. It's waterproof, right? Heals itself. That's one of the most incredible parts about it. We don't have to. If we could develop something like the skin that could be used, as a layer, a protective layer of something for soldiers that could heal itself, that'd be incredible. But we're not there yet, right? So it's this constantly regenerating organ system or tissue. If we laid out the whole skin, we would have a surface area of about 2 square meters. Okay, so it's a lot of skin. Okay, and it weighs on average about 10 pounds. All right, those are just some of the fun facts. I like to do that with each new organ system we get to. So you'll see some more of that as we keep going. So first of all, let's talk about the functions of the skin. Okay, as is obvious, it's a physical barrier. Okay, and there's these multiple barriers. We're going to talk about the first one is a physical barrier. Okay, the skin has many layers of a protein called keratin. Okay, keratin is just a special protein, nice and thick and strong, and so it can even thicken more in certain areas where stress is normally applied to it, and that's what happens when we get a callus. Right, the bottom of your feet are kind of that way. Certain parts of your toes might be that way, and your hands, the more you use things. When you start learning to play guitar, the tips of your fingers get calluses, right? That's your skin's response to protect, right? And that's to protect from friction, okay? Or pressure. Okay, all right, then we've got also part of the physical barrier is made up by oil glands, sebaceous oil glands, okay? That they release oil and glycoproteins, okay? What does that cause? That waterproofs our skin, okay? Water and oil don't mix, so that waterproofs our skin. This is important both to keep water in and out, okay? We don't want if our skin is we'll see in a second, it holds a lot of blood, which is a lot of water, and so if we had a layer that let the water out, we'd be in a lot of trouble. And we also don't want to let extra water in through our skin. We also have protection against the sun, right, with the pigment called melanin. Okay, that actually goes around the nuclei of skin cells and protects the DNA from being damaged. Okay, also hair is important, protecting against abrasion as well as sun, as well as insects. We'll talk about that in a sec. All right, so that's all part of what's known as the physical barrier of skin. Okay. Secondly, we've got the chemical barrier. So chemical barrier are chemicals that are just found on the skin. They're not living things, but they're chemicals that can damage potential invaders. Okay. So the skin is covered in bacteria. Okay. Good bacteria, bad bacteria. And so part of what the body does to make sure that bacteria doesn't grow out of control is to release something called the acid mantle. This is a layer of secretions on the skin that give the skin a low pH, and this really just stops bacteria from multiplying too much. Okay. Also, we have these little proteins called defensins all around our skin, and they're shown here. These little purple ones. Okay. Pretty much, when they interact with a bacteria, they drill holes through the membrane of the bacteria and punch holes in it and destroy the bacteria. And that's a special protein that does that called defensins. So that's the barrier number 2. Barrier number 3 is called the biological barrier. In this case, these are things that are living, i.e. cells that are protecting us. Okay, so we have immune cells in our epidermis, that's the more outer layer, called the Langerhans cells. Okay, these are phagocytic, so they will eat things, eat invaders, right? And then these are part of creating an immune response if things are invading us. Secondly, we have macrophages. Again, those are also phagocytic, larger cells, but those are found only in the dermis, not the epidermis. All right, so that's a biological barrier. Secondly, another function of the skin is temperature regulation. Okay, temperature regulation is very important. Body's got to stay in a very tight range of temperatures. Okay, so body temperature is sensed by our nervous system. Right, we have special thermoreceptors. We'll talk about those more next semester, but those are telling our brain constantly what the temperature is of our skin and of our body. Okay, and as soon as those start telling the brain we're getting a little bit too hot, that causes vasodilation, which means blood vessels getting bigger. BV's blood vessels increase in size. Okay, and so that sends more blood to the skin. Okay, so, and it also causes sweating. All right, just the opposite happens if it's too cold, causes vasoconstriction, that decreases sweating and also decreases blood to the skin. If we decrease blood to the skin, we keep it at our core, and it's easier to keep it warm. If we have it out on our periphery, out in the skin, then it cools down quicker. Okay, so secondly, we have constant heat production because of our metabolism breaking down energy, breaking down those ATP molecules, and we need to, we're constantly making a bunch of heat, and we constantly have to get rid of that heat, okay? And so we need to get rid of heat, and mainly by two ways. One is just by radiating heat out of our bodies, like when somebody's hot and you sit next to them and you can just feel that heat radiating off of them. That's radiation. But secondly, evaporation is the biggest one, and that's what we already talked about, where we sweat and that liquid turns from, that sweat turns from liquid to gas, and that energy required to change the state of that gas is taken out of the body, okay? And so we sweat anywhere from around ½ liter per day up to 12 liters per day. That's 3 gallons if we're exercising a lot, sweating a lot. So lots and lots of sweat. Humans are big time sweaters, and we're really good at controlling our energy or our temperature because of that. Okay, other functions of the skin, obviously very important for sensation. Touch, both in the epidermis and the dermis. Temperature, pressure, pain, these are only in the dermis. And then hair follicles are important because certain things like bugs walking on us or wind blowing over us may not be enough to actually stimulate these touch receptors. But if it bends a hair, then we'll feel that. We can feel that light movement on the skin. Okay, also important, skin helps us with vitamin D synthesis. UV light that comes from the sun is necessary for calcium absorption in the stomach as well. Okay, and then in order to make vitamin D, we need that sun, the energy from the sun to do that, and that's a process that those skin cells go through. Okay, so if we don't have enough vitamin C, our bones get soft and kind of wobbly, and that's known as rickets. Okay, and that's what this poor guy has here. Okay, so some other functions of the skin. It's a reservoir for blood, okay, and that's all in the dermis, okay, which is the deeper layer of the skin. The dermis holds about 5% of our total blood, okay. And the nice thing about this is that it can just kind of be stored there, even though it is kind of moving a little bit. A lot of it's stored there, and then if we need it, let's say we start exercising or we're sweating a lot, we need to move it around the body more. We've lost some blood. The body can vasoconstrict all those vessels in the dermis and then send all of that blood into circulation to be used. Okay, so again we see the epidermis here, which is this top layer. Okay, and then we got the dermis down here, which is this bottom layer, or more of the middle layer, and then this third layer called the hypodermis isn't actually part of the skin, but that's where the fat layer is. But this dermis is where lots and lots of blood is. This is where the blood reservoir is. Okay, another function is the skin helps us to excrete things that we don't want. Nitrogenous waste products, okay? So when we break down proteins, we excrete these nitrogenous waste products, and some of that comes out in our sweat. Okay. Secondly, sweating helps us get rid of sodium and chloride and water if we have an excess of that. Okay, so let's look at those layers of the skin I was just talking about. Again, the epidermis is this top layer. That is epithelial tissue. Okay, we've already talked about epithelial tissue. We know all about that. Okay, we'll talk about what you've talked about what type it is and all of that. Okay, secondly, we have the dermis, which is connective tissue. Okay, so here's why the skin's an organ, right? We have multiple different types of tissue coming together to create it. Okay, so we got epithelial tissue, connective tissue, and then third, we have the hypodermis, not really part of the skin, but again, this is just some more connective tissue, which is mostly fat. Okay, so let's talk about the cell types that we find here in the epidermis. Okay, first of all, the most prominent cell type are called the keratinocytes. Okay, function of these is primarily that physical barrier. Okay, we literally lose millions of these per day. We have a full new set of keratinocytes about every month. Okay, the deepest layer of these keratinocytes is alive. Okay, meaning that they still have a full nucleus, they still they're a fully functioning cell. But then as new ones are formed above that, those ones are pushed up and up and up higher, and eventually all their organelles are removed and replaced with just packing it full of the keratin. Okay, and so by the time those cells are on the top, they're just full of protein, and they're not actually living, functioning cells. Okay, those cells are held together by desmosomes, as we've talked about before. Okay, next are the melanocytes. Melanocytes are important because they make pigment. Okay, so they make pigment, and then they can send that pigment into the keratinocytes to help protect them, and then also give the skin its color. Okay, and that's due to the type and amount of pigment. We also have Langerhans cells. Okay, those are those phagocytic cells we talked about, and we have Merkel cells, all in the epidermis. These are touch detectors, part of the nervous system. Okay, so if we look at the layers of the epidermis and cell types, we can see all those dead keratinocytes up here, right? They start looking a little bit more normal when we get down here, but these ones down at the very bottom down here, this basal layer, which is shown here, right? That basal layer is where all those cells are still dividing and living. Okay, so the first cell type that we're pointing to right there, that's the keratinocytes. Okay, now B there, you can see it kind of stretching out, reaching. Those are the Langerhans cells. Okay, and then for C, desmosomes, you can see the actual desmosomes connecting the cells together if you look closely. Okay, D is a melanin granule as well as a melanocyte. So this big gray one is a melanocyte. You can see its long cellular extensions reaching out, filling up those keratinocytes with pigment as they go up. And then lastly, the Merkel cell, which is the part of the nervous system, right down there close to the dermis. Okay, thing about a blister, what happens when you have a clear blister, or just a water blister, is really just separating layers of these keratinocytes. And when you separate those layers, that fills with water, and that's a water blister. Talk more about a blood blister later. Okay, so this is just kind of the process of pigmentation. You can look at figure 5.8 in your book to get a little bit more information on this. But we can see the melanocyte here. We can see it creates these packets of pigment protein, and it sends it out those cellular extensions, and it's going to put it right into the keratinocyte, and then it wraps around the nucleus and protects that nucleus from the sun. Pretty cool process. Okay, the next layer is called the dermis. Right, in the dermis, the fibers are mostly collagen fibers, some elastic, some reticular fibers. Okay, the cells are mostly going to be fibroblasts here, and the ground substance as part of the connective tissue is very gel-like. Okay, functions of the dermis are to support the skin. Okay, this is the hard part, the hide of animals. It's very vascularized, very strongly innervated. This is where we find our accessory structures like our hair follicles, our sweat, and oil glands. So the layers of the dermis include the papillary layer, which is made up of areolar connective tissue. This is where diffusion happens. This holds our capillaries for us, and this is the reservoir for water and salt. Okay, this is characterized by papilla, which are shown here. Okay, and these papilla are little finger-like projections that stick up into the kind of holes and the opposite sides of the epidermal ridges. Okay, and there's little capillary loops and nerve endings in these, since the epidermis is epithelial tissue and it's not, doesn't have a blood supply. It makes it for a nice structure that these papilla stick up and into these dermal grooves and epidermal ridges to give the epidermis some blood supply. And the dermal ridges are found only in very thick skin. Okay, and that's kind of looks more like this. This is what makes us fingerprints, but we find this underneath the papilla, kind of some tread for traction and enhanced sensation. Okay, so looking at the dermis, the next layer is called the reticular layer. Okay, different than reticular connective tissue. Make sure you catch that difference. Okay, it's made up of dense irregular connective tissue, not reticular connective tissue. This gives the dermis 80% of its thickness. Okay, we can see the papillary layers of the dermis here, and then the rest, all of this down here, is the reticular layer of the dermis. So this is thick collagen bundles, gives it strength, stretch, and flexibility. Okay, and then finally, in those locations where we do have thick skin, like our palms of our hands, fingertips, soles of our feet, we really have a whole extra layer of skin that we haven't talked about. We'd add to this, okay? And then beyond that extra layer, all of the different epidermal layers are thicker than they would be in thin skin. The papilla, the papilla are larger, they stick up higher, and there's just more of them. And then this is the one place that we find those epidermal ridges. Okay, and then we also typically find calluses in these places. Okay, and then the place we find thin skin is pretty much everywhere else, and this is where we find hair follicles. So there's no hair follicles over here in the thick skin. All right, guys, and that pretty much wraps it up. Made that nice and quick. So study that hard and be ready for the quiz on Monday.